Good afternoon. Welcome everyone. I hope your audio and video are working and that mine are as well. I'd like to welcome all of you to our Marin Coalition program today. This is our March presentation. Again, a virtual program on Zoom due to the pandemic. My name is Scott Pinsky. I'm the chair of the Marin Coalition, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our program today. We're delighted to have you join us. Before we begin today's program, let me tell you about our next event. We've scheduled for April two speakers, Dennis Mulligan, the General Manager of Golden Gate Transit District, and Nancy Whelan, the General Manager of Marin Transit. Excuse me. They will be presenting a discussion entitled Current and Future Challenges and Opportunities of Operating a Public Transit System. Quite a bit going on in the transit area, obviously due to the pandemic, and huge changes in ridership and workflow. So it'll be interesting to hear from them next month. That will be on Tuesday, April 27 at noon, and we'll be sending out information on that in our regular emails. If you're not on our email list and you would like to be, please just visit our website, marincoalition.org. It's very easy to sign up to get our free emails. For those not aware, we are an all-volunteer, nonprofit public affairs organization here in Marin. We invite viewers to become members if they would like. You can visit our website and find us there, as I mentioned. But anyone is welcome to and encouraged to participate by attending our programs online at no cost. And we hope you'll continue to come back. For today's program, a couple technical issues. We are using the Q&A button as opposed to the chat feature of Zoom. So if you have questions during the program or during the Q&A portion of the presentation, just click on the Q&A. We'll see those questions and get as many to the speaker as we can, and hopefully we can get to all your questions today. And then finally, there's a feature for those who would like to see essentially what are the subtitles of the program. There's a feature in Zoom called Live Transcript. If you look at the bottom of the Zoom window, if you have a current version of the program, you'll see Live Transcript. You click on that and click Start, and that will essentially give you subtitles. So you can see me in French. No, it'll be in English. I wish I could speak French. Anyhow, I'm going to go on and get started. Today we'd like to welcome as our honored guest, David Vautin, AICP. David is the Assistant Director of Major Plans at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG. With a decade of experience in regional planning, he currently manages Plan Bay Area 2050, which will be the topic today, among other things. In 2018 and 2019, he led the Innovative Horizon Initiative, which explored resilient and equitable strategies for an uncertain future through what-if scenario planning. From 2014 to 2019, he also created and managed the award-winning Vital Signs Performance Monitoring Project, which tracks a region-wide statistical model on transportation, land use, population, and the economy, environmental quality, and social equity. Mr. Vautin received his Master of Science degree from UC Berkeley and his Bachelor of Science degree from Cornell University. And it is now my pleasure to welcome David Vautin.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks everyone for having me today. I'm going to load up my slides here. So again, thanks for this opportunity to share a little more on the region's long-range plan, Plan Bay Area 2050, which is currently in the fourth and final year of its development. MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, update our regional long-range plan every 4 years, but this particular update is a fairly sizable one, not only to incorporate critical issues of an uncertain future, but also to take a hard look at how we can modify the regional and local strategies to make our region a more equitable place going forward. The current process really began in 2018 with an effort known as Horizon. This particular initiative seems very timely today. It was about exploring different futures given the high levels of uncertainty in the political, economic, technological, and other realms in our society. We recognize that the Bay Area doesn't have control over all of these aspects of our world. There are global and national shifts and trends at play, and the Bay Area has to respond to those challenges. This seems very timely, obviously, with the pandemic and the economic uncertainty our region faces. The idea of looking at public policies and trying to understand which policies are effective across the broadest range of future circumstances. That initiative really formed the foundation for this new next generation regional plan, because the recommendations in terms of public policies and investments, which we call strategies, were stress tested against a wide range of conditions, and we understand how resilient and equitable they are. Over the course of the latter half of 2019, throughout 2020 and leading into January of 2021, the Commission and the board developed what's known as the Blueprint, which is a set of strategies that can influence the region's future outcomes for transportation, housing, the economy, and the environment. And in fact, in January, that final blueprint was approved as the preferred alternative for Plan Bay Area 2050. And we're now beginning to think about how to actually implement or advance some of these strategies in the coming years. The process that we engaged in over the last three and a half years now really was one that included many different voices across the Bay Area. Between early 2018 and the end of 2020, we had more than 130 public meetings, over 100 different public events, including in-person and virtual events, obviously during the pandemic, pop-up events at farmers markets and the like in the time before the pandemic, and focus groups in person and virtual, especially with communities that have been historically not well included in planning processes. We also held more than 60 stakeholder events with working groups, workshops, and webinars. And from that, we've gotten more than 33,000 comments that inform the plan that you'll be seeing today. And 15,000 folks over the course of the planning process participated. Again, we continue to do more engagement as we go into this fourth and final year of the process, and expect to have a major round of engagement this summer as we release the draft plan document and the various environmental analyses required under state law. So what is the final blueprint for Plan Bay Area 2050? Well, it all starts with the vision that was adopted by the ABAG board and by the Commission in the fall of 2019. And that's to ensure that by the year 2050, the Bay Area is more affordable, connected, diverse, healthy, and vibrant, not just for some residents, but for all Bay Area residents. And to do this, we recognize that all of the topic areas that affect people in the Bay Area, whether it's parks and recreation, economic development, resilience to future natural hazards like earthquakes or sea level rise, transportation investments, affordable housing, they all connect with one another. And so what the blueprint does is it looks at strategies and tries to connect the dots between transportation, housing, and economy and the environment to create a package that works better together. It all starts with where we grow as a region. And we know that there are some critical areas that need to be protected going forward. These include areas outside of urban growth boundaries, including locally identified priority conservation areas. It also includes unmitigated high hazard areas that might be at risk of fire or sea level rise if mitigations are not advanced. The plan also works to focus growth in critical locations, preserving many of our communities outside these areas, but really focusing future growth into denser, more walkable downtowns and other critical centers. You can see there's a whole slew of different acronyms on screen. I won't go through all of that, but basically these areas shown in color on the map to the right are critical places for future housing and jobs growth. In Marin County, this includes locally nominated places like downtown San Rafael, as well as key locations around smart stations and ferry terminals, where there's an opportunity for folks to be able to leverage those transportation assets in their daily lives. In order to accommodate the significant growth the region is forecasted to see between now and 2050, we needed to look beyond many of the traditional locally nominated places and expand that geography to include communities that have historically not identified places for housing. This helps us advance critical climate goals that the state has identified, as well as important social equity goals that the Bay Area certainly prioritizes as well. Between 2015 and 2050, we expect that there will be roughly 1.4 million new households in the region and 1.4 million new jobs. So it's important to find places to accommodate that future growth. So getting beyond the geographies of the plan, how will we do that? How will we support current and future residents, current and future businesses, and create a place that more folks want to live in the future? We do this with different strategies, and a strategy is really an action that could be taken at the local, county, regional, or state level to make the Bay Area a better place in response to future conditions. The plan includes 35 strategies clustered under 11 key themes. I'll go through some of the strategies in a moment, but at a high level, some of the key themes of Plan Bay Area 2050 include maintaining and optimizing our existing transportation system, creating healthy and safe streets, and building a next generation transit network. In the housing realm, the plan prioritizes strategies to protect and preserve affordable housing, spur housing production at all income levels, and create more inclusive communities. In the economic realm, the plan focuses on improving economic mobility, which, as we all know, is sorely needed in a region with vast income inequality, and shifting the location of jobs to better match housing and jobs in the future. And finally, in the environmental realm, the plan includes strategies to reduce risks from hazards like sea level rise and wildfires, while expanding access to parks and open space, and importantly, reducing climate emissions. We do have a document on planbayarea.org, which is the project website, where you can read all about the specific strategies in the plan. So let's talk a little bit about the strategies and what they might mean for a place like Marin County. So starting with our 5 guiding principles, the first, of course, is making the region more affordable. So the plan includes strategies to reduce the region's extreme cost of living by making sure that as we build new homes, they're more focused in more walkable, transit-oriented places where those greenhouse gas emissions tend to be lower. We're also focused on making sure that the housing built in those locations is affordable for folks at all different income levels. And this may require subsidies from the public, nonprofit, and private sectors to make sure that those units are produced and preserved. And lastly, to make the region more affordable, there are strategies about providing greater income-based discounts for things like tolls and transit fares to make sure that the prices for those are better aligned with the income levels of each user. Moving to the connected principle, it starts with creating a world-class public transportation system, emphasizing both maintenance and ridership as critical twin goals. Furthermore, the plan includes strategies to standardize transit fares across the region and advocate for seamless mobility and schedule coordination. A good example of this is in San Rafael, where there's currently a major transfer hub at the transit center. Places like that, we want to make sure that there's improved schedule coordination, so it's easier to transfer between local, express, bus services, as well as regional rail services like SMART. And then finally, on our freeway network, it's important to really think strategically about how we can reduce emissions and reduce congestion over the long term. We all know that as we widen freeways in our region, oftentimes that capacity gets eaten up very quickly by additional automobile traffic. So one solution would be to better price the system to manage supply and demand. And of course, it's critical to include key equity mitigations to make sure that folks aren't disproportionately burdened by this. But this particular strategy really enables us to tackle traffic congestion in the most meaningful, more permanent way, as opposed to short-term fixes like freeway widening that have been pursued in the 20th century. Our region's diversity is something that many residents have told us that they cherish. And so we need to think strategically about how to preserve that diversity and advance equity in this plan. For this component of the plan, the strategy is really focused first and foremost on protecting existing renters from being displaced. There's a patchwork of different renter protection policies across the Bay Area. And so for folks who might be living in what are called naturally affordable units that could easily be displaced due to a lack of strong renter protections in their jurisdiction, it's key to take actions on that front. And that would certainly involve action by local partners in places like Marin County. Second, the plan really works to tackle some of the racial inequities that are baked into our land use pattern. The 20th century really was a period where government policies played a key role in the segregation of households in our region and across the country. And so to unwind it will take a number of decades, but we need to start now. Some of the strategies in the plan are really about encouraging more affordable housing to be focused in higher resource areas that might have excluded those sorts of residents in the past. And as we build out new housing developments on public or community-owned land, making sure that there's significant shares of deeply affordable housing on those is going to be especially critical. And then third, the plan really focuses on trying to reduce income inequality. And we recognize that the Bay Area can't do this alone, but there's opportunities for state action in areas like a universal basic income pilot or program that can help those folks at the lowest end of the income spectrum move towards the middle class over time. When it comes to making the Bay Area a healthier place to live, there's a wide gamut of strategies in the plan. It really starts with striving to eliminate traffic deaths by making streets safer for all roadway users. A regional Vision Zero policy is really about trying to get to zero deaths. And while Plan Bay Area 2050 strategies don't get us all the way there, reducing speed limits, redesigning local streets to make them safer, and building protected bikeways and improved pedestrian facilities are key pieces of the puzzle. And that's certainly the case in Marin County. While there's some key high quality bicycle infrastructure in the county, like some of the trails, there are still many, many gaps. And improving the safety on our local roads is going to be especially critical for those short distance trips where there's an opportunity to walk or ride a bicycle to the corner store or to the coffee shop, as opposed to jumping in the car. Second, on the environment and health side of the plan includes protections for tens of thousands of Bay Area homes from rising sea levels. And in Marin County, this is a place where that is really at the front line of sea level rise impacts. And those protections that will last over the 30-year horizon of this plan are disproportionately located in Marin County because there's communities all throughout the county. But as an example, places like the Canal neighborhood of San Rafael that sit on that front line of 1 or 2 feet of sea level rise will put them underwater. And so through a suite of protections, both built infrastructure as well as natural environmental improvements like marshland restoration, we can work to protect those existing communities from displacement. And although it may sound like a lot of money, in total over a 30-year period, the sea level rise protections cost about $19 billion. It's actually quite a bargain compared to traditional transportation infrastructure, or even just having to rebuild all of that housing that would otherwise be lost. Furthermore, the plan includes some new strategies related to other types of hazards like earthquakes. We have a lot of aging infrastructure and homes in the region. And many of the homes that are at the greatest risk of earthquake are in places where the residents just don't have the financial means to retrofit their homes on their own. And so using a means-based approach to provide additional discounts, help subsidize those sorts of improvements, can help save those homes from damage in an earthquake, which is highly likely over a 30-year planning horizon. Lastly, but certainly not least on the environmental front, the plan includes a whole suite of strategies to tackle climate change. This includes greater regional action to accelerate the state's move towards electrification of our fleet. Of course, the governor has identified a key goal in 2035 to ensure that statewide all new vehicles are electric vehicles. We'd like to see faster progress of that in the Bay Area, and by directing more money for subsidies and chargers, that can help on that front. And doing so in a way that's more equitable, where we provide especially significant benefits to encourage lower income folks to trade in their vehicles for an electric vehicle can create some real opportunities. Lastly, the economy has really come into focus as a critical issue for the region as we've suffered the impacts of COVID-19 and as we face uncertainty over the next few years coming out of this recession that we're in. The plan focuses on encouraging more job growth in housing-rich areas through financial incentives and streamlining, providing incentives to locate near regional rail stations that are in housing-rich areas, shorten those commute trips, and also encourage more reverse commuting. Furthermore, we can increase densities around these transit hubs to provide more opportunities for growth in areas close to transit and in areas that are highly walkable. Another key aspect on the economic front is making sure we're preserving critical industrial lands. We've all seen the importance, not only these jobs for middle wage employment in our region, but also for warehouses and distribution that are essential for the e-commerce economy. With those lands not available, if they were not available in the future, those jobs might move to places like the Central Valley, far from Bay Area residents, and also creating really long goods movement trips to get to and from those locations. And so by preserving these key industrial lands known as priority production areas, we can help those jobs remain in the Bay Area and also create opportunities for further growth of middle wage jobs by investing in training programs and business incubators in these critical industrial lands. And then last here, and again, certainly not least, is the need to provide assistance for folks who need access to high-speed internet. As witnessed by today's presentation, we can all see how important it is to be able to participate in the digital economy and to be able to communicate and work with others from all over the region and certainly all over the globe. And so as we go forward, and we've seen some progress on this on the federal level, it's really making sure that we're doing all we can to help out folks who are in underserved or low-income communities have access to high-speed broadband. So that way they're able to participate in work, school, whatever the particular needs are there, and make sure that they're part of the connected community that we live in. So Plan Bay Area 2050 is a wide-ranging plan. It really tries to look at all of these different dots and connect them: transportation, housing, economic development, and environmental resilience. And it's certainly not a cheap plan. To implement the full plan would cost roughly $1.4 trillion over the next 30 years. Now, many of those revenues are existing. They come from federal, state, regional, or local sources, but there are some critical gaps which this slide shows. In particular, on the housing side, as you can see, there's a significant amount of new revenues that would be required to execute on this plan. And that's why it'll be so essential to work with the state and local jurisdictions over the coming years to identify those resources going forward. Other elements of the plan, in particular, the environment element with those sea level rise protections, or some of the parks and recreation strategies to address our park inequities that exist today, have significant funding gaps as well. So that's where MTC and ABAG can play a key role, is working with local jurisdictions, working with the state to try to gather those resources to make the Bay Area a better place. And it's not going to happen all at once. This is a 30-year vision, but really in an incremental and thoughtful process, engaging with communities over the next 5 years, we hope to chip away at these significant financial needs. So what might the final blueprint mean for communities across the Bay Area? Our analysis indicates that by advancing all of these 35 strategies, we'd be able to ensure that the vast majority of that new growth occurs in walkable, transit-rich communities. We'd also be able to shift roughly 20% of commuters away from driving towards other modes, whether that is telecommuting, whether that's walking, biking, taking transit, as well as for non-commute trips, which are equally essential. In fact, only a quarter of all trips in the region are commute trips. So while telecommuting may be a great solution for white collar workers in that regard, given that many of the trips that those folks are taking are actually non-commute trips, we need to make sure that we're providing modal options for those folks as well. And that's where those investments, again, in bicycle infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, and really high quality transit service throughout our region are so important. And on the environmental front, the final blueprint also yields a whole suite of benefits. We're able to protect 98% of homes in the region from sea level rise over the next 30 years, and 100% of homes in what we call communities of concern, which are lower income or minority communities, those like the Canal neighborhood of San Rafael that may not have the resources to protect themselves without some assistance from the region or the state. And the funding in the plan would be sufficient to make sure that all high-risk Bay Area homes are retrofitted to reduce seismic and wildfire risks, while focusing all of our urban growth within the existing urban growth boundaries, not requiring more expansion to sprawl outwards. These are all some of the key benefits of the final blueprint, and there's a whole bunch more information on planbayarea.org if you're interested in some of the broader benefits beyond these. I'm not going to jump into just a few key metrics to highlight how the plan could make the Bay Area a better place, and then we'll be able to take some questions at the end as well. The first question we often get is, what might this mean for where people live and work in the region? On the left, you'll see a bubble map that shows where future housing might occur if these strategies were advanced. On the right, you'll see where future job growth might occur. So starting with the left, I know there's a lot of statistics here, but you can see that the bulk of the growth would really be occurring in the big three cities, as well as other communities that ring San Francisco Bay. 85% of the growth would be in those growth geographies I showed earlier. And 82% of all future housing growth would be located in areas that we consider transit rich. So those are places with those 15-minute services, kind of show up and go, high quality transit. You also note that housing and jobs are disproportionately focused in the South Bay, where 1/3 of all future growth would be located, as well as in the San Francisco and East Bay areas, with the North Bay seeing relatively limited growth compared to the rest of the region. When it comes to job growth, some interesting trends here. Again, similarly, we see a strong matching as a result of the strategies between where future jobs would be focused and where future housing would be focused. Just a few percentage points of difference in many of the cases of these various counties. But notably in the North Bay, you'll see that the county position for the strongest job growth is Solano County, with its access to the Capital Corridor line, which will eventually feed in to a new Trans-Bay tunnel connecting Oakland and San Francisco. And so Solano County will be integrated into the core of the region in a really strong way as a result of the investments in the final blueprint. The growth levels are lower in many of the other counties, and Marin is especially an outlier here. In fact, we project that Marin County might even see a slight decline in jobs going forward. And that really is a reflection of a couple different trends that are already ongoing. One being obviously the rise of e-commerce and the decline of retail sector employment, as well as in Marin County, which is also the oldest county by median age of all 9 Bay Area counties, just simply folks leaving the workforce, and that those jobs would locate elsewhere as the level of retirees in Marin County continues to tick upwards. One other key question we get is, what might this mean for affordability in the Bay Area? As we all know, the Bay Area is not a cheap place to live. And if you are at the lower end of the income spectrum, it can be especially burdensome. For the average household, you can see on the left, this is how a household budget looked like in 2015. About 33% of the household budget was spent on housing, and about 25% on transportation. What you can see on the right, it's a pretty substantial change, particularly on the housing side of the equation. So we're able to bring down the share of income spent on housing from 33% to 21% as a result of the strategies and investments in the final blueprint. And that's especially driven by the fact that there's such a strong focus on addressing the needs of those who are low or moderate low income. Another key statistic here is related to the mode choice. In 2015, before the pandemic, roughly 70% of Bay Area residents drove to work. And this was actually higher in the North Bay. About 13% took transit, 5% walked and bike, and 10% on a typical day actually worked from home. Now, not everyone has the opportunity to work from home. In fact, not all workers are in office-based jobs. Not even all high-income earners have the opportunity to work from home. Say a doctor still needs to go to the hospital, but a significant share can. And as we look into the future, we expect that that would tick upwards to roughly about 17% of folks choosing to work from home on a typical day. That's about a third or 40% or so of those white collar commuters on a typical day. And obviously, other types of employment, that, especially for lower income workers, it's very difficult to telecommute, say, to a service sector job. And so we need to continue to provide those modal options for folks who will continue to need to go to their workplace. And so that's where the other investments in the plan come into play, investments in transit that help us increase that to roughly 1 in 5 commuters taking transit. And those investments in pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure that allow us to double the number of commute trips in that slice of the pie. All in all, we're able to shift the Bay Area with these strategies from a place where 7 out of 10 folks drive to work to just about half of the population uses the automobile to get to their workplace in the future. Lastly, I wanted to touch on some of the climate implications of the plan. There is a statutory target that Plan Bay Area 2050 has to meet that's set by the state to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, of course, we expect emissions will be even lower than shown on the screen here once you take into effect all of the state and federal policies that are working to shift us to a greener, more electric future. The state doesn't let us take credit for those, so those are excluded from the arrows on the screen. The last plan, Plan Bay Area 2040, just barely met the previous target of a 15% reduction between 2005 and 2035. And in fact, once we reanalyzed that past plan with some of the key updated assumptions that we incorporated this plan as a response to consultation with the state, we found that plan's reductions would be even lower than before, just 4%, leaving us a really large gap to fill with new strategies between the last plan and the new higher 19% per capita target. Ultimately, the final blueprint was able to achieve and even slightly surpass that target with all these new strategies, from pricing our corridors, a greater focus on affordable housing, these key investments in electrification of our fleet, as well as travel demand management initiatives, and asking the private sector to step up in that regard as well. So ultimately, our forecast is that the final blueprint could reduce these emissions by roughly 22% by 2035. So there's much more in terms of statistics and metrics associated with the final blueprint on planbayarea.org, but I'll just quickly touch on what's next for this long-range plan in its 4th and final year. So first, if you're interested in learning more, I've included the link here, and I think the Marin Coalition will also be posting this on their website to go read up on the final blueprint, the different analyses, and review the different data sets available. Over the coming months, with both approval by the Commission and the board as this being the final blueprint and the preferred alternative, we're moving into the implementation phase, which means talking about what actions MTC and ABAG could advance, as well as new partnerships we could form with local jurisdictions, nonprofits, state agencies, and other key partners. We just recently rolled out some initial implementation actions at the MTC and ABAG committees this month, and we continue to develop that near-term implementation plan. It'll be included as part of the draft Plan Bay Area 2050 release later this spring. We're also conducting an environmental analysis to understand the environmental impacts of the plan and to study some different alternatives to it as well. In the spring and early summer, we'll be doing a final round of public engagement. We'll also be presenting to boards of supervisors across the region to share with them some of the ideas for implementation, as well as an overview of the plan, and engaging with critical communities, low income and communities of color through focus groups and other forums. We'll be taking all that feedback into account as we finalize the plan itself, as well as the various reports and the environmental analysis. And we expect that Plan Bay Area 2050 will be considered for adoption by the Commission and by the ABAG board in fall of this year. That's not the end of the road for Plan Bay Area 2050. Of course, all these implementation actions will be a key focus through 2025. And our organizations will really be looking at how to push forward on each of these 35 strategies in the final blueprint as part of that phase. With that, I'd like to pause here and see whether there's some questions.
And indeed there are. Thank you, Dave. And we do have a number of questions that have been floating in and will continue to float in, I'm sure. So I'll continue to monitor those. Let me start off with Frida Zolan's question. Are there any plans now or in the near future for senior low-income housing?
That's a great question. So first of all, I just want to emphasize, we're developing a long-range regional plan here. And this plan basically identifies how much funding is available and how much additional funding would be needed for low-income housing for a variety of folks, including seniors. And so that is what we've identified here is basically a pathway between now and the year 2050 to build out housing so we can ensure that all low-income households have access to deed-restricted, basically permanently protected, affordable housing going forward. And we are actively working at the state level to try to secure more monies for affordable housing for the Bay Area. So MTC and ABAG developed a housing financing authority, which was put into place in 2020. And now it's really a matter of going and procuring more financial resources to help out local jurisdictions on that front. So I know there's a lot of good work, but obviously the quantities of that housing are still falling well short. And that's a key sign that there's a financial gap.
Okay, we have some comments here and questions from Stephen Nessel. I'll try to read them quickly. Some of these are observations, obviously, and then he's got some inquiries as well. 2020 was a lesson in humility. COVID completely changed the trajectory of the economy, politics, and the environment. It is said, if you want to see God laugh, make a plan. Plan Bay Area 1 was doomed from the beginning. The assumptions were completely unsupported by official California Department of Finance data. It was based upon a secret econometric model created by ABAG and MTC economists. We have witnessed the failure. No one anticipated the massive changes in the world. Who would have guessed that we would have elected a former TV reality show star as president, that we would have had a worldwide pandemic and peace in the Middle East, all of this in the last 5 years. Let me get to the kernel of the question, I believe. How does Plan Bay Area anticipate changes in the world? It presumes that it can guide it through government policy and forced choices. Would a different form of government, a benevolent socialism, be better suited to achieve Plan Bay Area? A lot in there, but I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I kind of take the first part of Stephen's question, because I don't think it's my place to comment on the federal government here in the United States. I think it's a bit of commentary from the commenter. But I'll talk a little bit about changes in the world, because I think that's a fair point. That was one of the key challenges we identified with the earlier iterations of Plan Bay Area, is that the Bay Area, like a lot of other places in the United States, when developing a long-range plan, would develop a singular forecast for the future and try to optimize against it. Now, that model may have worked better in past decades when the future seemed more predictable, but not even before COVID, we were recognizing that the uncertainties with new technologies like autonomous vehicles, the rate of climate change, whether it's faster or slower, the boom bust cycle, all these different forces of uncertainty affect our planning. And so what we did to create this plan is we crafted these three really different futures to stress test each of the policies. In one future, it was called Rising Tides, Falling Fortunes. It had explored a world where the United States was on the decline, economic growth was stagnant, the region's levels of immigration dried up due to federal policies that were really targeting immigration and trying to slow it down, and looked at that world and tried to understand, well, how would the Bay Area respond to that? In another future, we looked at a world called Clean and Green, where there was aggressive federal action on climate change and promotion of environmental policies, but those had to be paired with higher taxes on the wealthy and other sorts of economic actions to fund those investments. To try to understand what that might mean for the Bay Area, how might we respond to that? And we studied a third future where we looked at really an economic boom and what new technologies could mean in terms of spillover growth into the mega region, the Central Valley and Sacramento, and how the region would respond to kind of an unprecedented level of high levels of growth. We put the policies that are in Plan Bay Area 2050 through the ringer, basically testing them against these three futures, trying to understand which ones made sense in which future and which ones fell short to strengthen them. So it's not to say that the plan is designed to predict the future, but the core of the plan are these public policy ideas that we think are at least made it through several of those futures I just laid out, and that better positions us depending on what happens next over the next 5 years, over the next 30 years.
Okay, moving on. We have a question from Grace Garrity. David, in the environmental and health strategies section of your discussion, the issue of banning new gas and diesel fuel stations was not listed. Is there a reason why not?
That's a great comment. It was actually that strategy idea wasn't really brought up to us during the engagement process. We also have some constraints from the state about what climate strategies we're allowed to include and which ones we aren't. They have to be strategies where we have more of a direct purview or ability to advance them. And obviously banning new gas stations, that may be something that's more easily implemented on the local level. But I think it's a really interesting idea, and certainly we've heard about Petaluma in Sonoma County advancing that, and perhaps more local governments will in the coming years.
Interesting. Susan Kirsch asks, I'm probably not the only one on the call who has followed Plan Bay Area since 2013 when the first plan was introduced. The criticism in 2013 was the manipulative quality of the ABAG MTC meetings, the tendency of staff to talk without listening, and a bureaucratic top-down approach detached from real needs and authentic interaction. Today, it seems like not much has changed. My question, what would it take to create authentic dialogue with the Plan Bay Area staff so that planning is relevant?
Thanks, Susan, for that question. I mean, I think we've taken advantage of some new tactics and techniques this cycle. For example, one of the great opportunities that COVID presented was the ability to do small focus groups with low income and communities of color more easily across the various cycles of our plan. And we've found that approach of small group discussions really allows for more of the dialogue that probably you're referring to, as opposed to those larger forums, the more traditional workshop style events. We also feel that the smaller pop-up events allow for more of that dialogue. Forums in an auditorium where there's a microphone and you only get to hear from a small sliver of the voices in the room because there's 100+ people, that doesn't allow for as much one-on-one conversation. And so we've really found those small pop-up events where we can have dialogues one-on-one with different members of the public to be a more effective way to hear folks' opinions. So we've taken some key steps in that regard, but would love to hear any suggestions you have on making our public engagement more effective.
Okay, let's move to a question from the mayor of San Rafael. Our new mayor, Kate Collin, asks, will MTC ABAG be advocating at the state level to have senior units of all affordability levels that are in retirement communities, but currently do not meet the housing definition count towards RHNA numbers?
So this is a little outside of the Plan Bay area realm. Thanks for that question, Madam Mayor. I'll say I don't know if there's a specific state bill on that particular topic. I know that we've just completed the illustrative allocations for the regional housing need allocation process, the RENA process you're referring to. It's definitely an interesting idea as a way to try to incentivize more senior units. So I can touch base with our legislative staffing and get back to you on that.
Okay, Linda Howman, I hope I'm saying that right, asks, what is the strategy to incentivize developers to build more affordable housing to offset labor costs in order to make building economically feasible?
So a few things on this topic. Feasibility for housing development varies widely across the region. In some places in our region, the market is there, including for high levels of inclusionary, low income and working class housing in those developments that could be paid for by the market rate units. Places say like San Francisco, where has historically been a stronger market. And then there are places in the Bay Area where the housing market is much weaker. You think of a community like Richmond, where placing an inclusionary requirement and trying to eke out more affordable units from the developer might cause the project not to pencil. And so that's why the plan really envisions a suite of different approaches that are locally specific. So for example, those inclusionary requirements would vary depending on the market feasibility of the place or the characteristics of that community. Similarly, by generating new monies for affordable housing preservation and production, that provides the opportunity for regional or local governments to help subsidize affordable housing developments more easily and make those things pencil out, even as the cost of development has gotten more and more expensive over time.
Okay, we have a question that I'm sure you get every single time you say your name. This is from Josh Labresco. Everyone wants more housing, but no one wants it in his or her own area. How do you get around that problem?
Josh, I think you just named the billion-dollar question. I think that I have a few thoughts on that issue, although I'd love to hear from the audience if you have ideas about how to get around that particular problem. I mean, a couple of thoughts come to mind. I mean, I think one is that the look and feel, the size and the scope of housing needs to be context specific to the communities that it's in, right? It's not a one size fits all when it comes to housing, but that all communities can do more and participate in helping to solve the housing crisis. And, yes, in San Francisco, it may be very appropriate for it to be a new 10-story building, but perhaps in a more suburban environment, it can be an accessory dwelling unit in a backyard or a new duplex or triplex that really fits the character of the community. It isn't a radical change, but it can create new opportunities for folks to live there. So I think that's a key part of the puzzle. And I think maybe the one other thought on that topic is really it's about bringing to bear public sector investments along with that housing. So it's not creating additional burdens on existing infrastructure. So it isn't just about the housing, but how can we make sure that as we build that new housing development, we build a terrific set of new sidewalks or bicycle infrastructure in that area? How do we make sure that we're protecting that not just that new development, but maybe all of the other neighboring neighborhoods in that city from sea level rise that might be maybe at risk of flooding in the next 30 or 100 years? it's, as we figure out where the appropriate places are for housing in each and every city, how do we go in and invest to make sure that the infrastructure is ready for that? That I think is a key portion of kind of getting over the hill on creating more inclusive housing in the region. So it's not just the housing, but it's also these public benefits that come along with it.
Okay, the questions are still pouring in, so I'll get through as many as quickly as I can. We still have a few minutes left. Doug Cooper asks, I'm glad that you have recognized the regressive impact of one price tolls and related. I'm thinking maybe there's a word missing here. Regressive impact of, one price tolls, I guess is what he means. But what about the impact of tolls on diverting traffic onto streets and even residential areas? I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a great question, Doug. That is an area that we continue to be concerned about. Our initial analysis in both Horizon and Plan Bay Area 2050, we didn't see a lot of that diversion. Now, in part, that's because the tolls are not super onerous. The tolls that have been explored in the Plan Bay Area 2050 process are about 15 cents per mile. So to go 10 miles, it's about $1.50. Given the travel time impacts of diverting off the freeway over to an arterial that might be 30 miles an hour instead of 65, our models aren't telling us that there's going to be super high demand for those longer trips just to save, a buck or two. That being said, one of the key implementation actions is we recognize that strategy, there's a need to gain further public support and understanding about it. And so we're going to be doing a 2-year-long study to explore different corridors where we could create a suite of new mobility options to pair along with pricing to help advance that particular strategy. And one of the things we'll be looking at in that study is which corridors do we see this risk of diversion on, and how could we work to avoid that in particular? How do we make sure that we're not leading to those neighborhood impacts as a result?
Okay, we have a multi-part question here. It might be actually different topics. So let me just read it all to you, Dave, and see if you can attack this in the time you have. This is from Kate Powers. Number 1, Marin does not have a fixed route transit that runs from population centers to large job or commercial areas. Flexible bus routes around the county are somewhat limited. If you plan for growth in housing without effective transit options, we will not be adding to congestion. Will we not be adding to congestion and greenhouse gases in Marin? Number 2, a previous Plan Bay Area 2050 forecast document forecasted a 14% decline in jobs in Marin. What assumptions changed that 1% decline is not a part of the forecasts? Hope I read that right. And thirdly, what if financing of infrastructure cannot keep up with forecasted growth and incentives for growth? Thank you for your presentation, David. And I can repeat any of those if you need.
No worries. Thanks, Scott and Kate. So let's take the first question about transit. So of course, Marin is a very special place. There are also some significant kind of geographical features that result in, it's not a location with a big grid of streets and parallel bus routes. It's really a place that's defined by Highway 101 and routes that are serving it. So the plan does include additional investments to make sure that all of our growth areas meet a minimum standard for transit quality. Obviously, going forward, those investments will be critical to make sure that those places are lower GHG places. But furthermore, you can also reduce greenhouse gas emissions even without transit if you can have more folks walking and biking to destinations, especially non-commute destinations. And even if they're driving, especially if they're driving an electric vehicle, but even if they're driving a gas-powered vehicle, if you can reduce the distance between origin and destination of the commute trip, you can bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And given that Marin County does have a significant jobs housing fit issue insofar that there's a number of low-wage jobs and not a lot of affordable housing, By providing opportunities for those folks to live closer to where they work, you can bring down greenhouse gas emissions even without public transit being a component of that individual person's solution. So it really is about having a combo of different solutions on greenhouse gas emissions. With regards to the second question, I think you may be mixing up apples and oranges. The forecast is the same, but you're referring to a decline in total jobs versus this was a graphic showing the share of jobs region-wide. So they're slightly different metrics. And then the last question is a good one. What if the financing of infrastructure cannot keep up with the forecasted growth? Well, I think we've seen a bit of this, right? In the past, few decades in the region, right? What we've seen is an incredible demand for folks to live in the Bay Area, but then we haven't kept up the pace on the housing side and the infrastructure side. And what that has meant is folks enduring extreme commutes, folks in overburdened housing, folks in areas where their housing is unstable because they could be evicted as their rents go up. There's all sorts of challenges. And so that is why it's so important to move forward each of the strategies together, as opposed to just advancing a handful of them, right? Because if you only advance the housing ones without going and pursuing the transportation funding to advance that or other types of infrastructure, you're going to have these sorts of challenges. And so that is really our goal, is to help advance and accelerate the suite of strategies over the next 5 years.
Susan Clough asks, again, a multi-part question, but roughly on the same themes, I think. Will you be looking at FEMA flood maps, landfill, marshland, and high-risk fire areas as part of environmental reviews for identified high-opportunity areas like San Rafael, Sausalito, and Tiburon? Intensifying development there and encouraging rezoning for high-density housing seems ill-advised, and yet that seems to be what is being encouraged to build more housing units. Also, what about the future water supply? And then lastly, public transit use in Marin has been decreasing since 1980. How do you address that? I find it difficult to think of these now as transit-rich hubs.
A lot of good questions there, Susan. So let's start at the top. So yes, in our environmental process, we are looking at all these sorts of different issues. We also exempted out some areas from being growth geographies that are in the very high fire risk category or in areas of unmitigated sea level rise. But I want to point out something super important, which is there is no place in the Bay Area that's not at risk from at least one hazard, if not many. Our region is a very hazard-rich place. You can't move away from being, at risk of some sort of earthquake impacts. There are flood and sea level rise impacts all over. There are a suite of these environmental challenges. And that is not completely unique to the Bay Area. Each region in the country has some sort of different key hazard, whether it's the Gulf Coast with hurricanes or, tornadoes in the Midwest or whatnot. And so as we move forward, what we're trying to do is be smarter about the locations within the region, recognizing everywhere has risk. Let's target places that are low or moderate risk compared to the region as a whole, but also building more resilient structures and infrastructure in places. Some of the towns you just named in Marin, like Sausalito and Tiburon, there are existing communities there that it's going to be important to protect. We can't relocate, or maybe it's ill-advised to relocate the entire downtown of Sausalito or Tiburon to somewhere else in the region. So in places where there are existing urban areas, the goal is really to build the infrastructure to protect them and then enable folks to live in these areas that now have an increased level of safety as a result of the infrastructure improvements brought to bear. The other thing with regards to water, we have been coordinating with the different water agencies throughout this process, including in the Horizon process, where we explored how those 3 futures would affect some of the water outcomes. But water is kind of an issue that will be explored in the environmental phase in particular coming up. And then lastly, public transit use, super interesting topic. I'm sure you'll hear more about this next time when you hear from the executives from the two transit operators. But one of the fascinating trends that you can see on our Vital Signs website is how Marin has been a regional leader in telecommuting. And that definitely increased over the years. And so that's kind of an example of something that chipped away at transit use over time. Another thing is that aging population. So it was historically the case that a lot of Marin commuters commuted to San Francisco. And as the population of those former white collar commuters has declined, as they've aged out of the workforce or perhaps left Marin, they have not been replaced with additional commuters. And you'll see Golden Gate's transit ridership has gone significantly down. And that's one of the aspects that has played a role in that ridership reduction. And so that's why we can't put all of our chips on one mode, right? We talk a lot about public transportation, and it's really important for the region. But we need to also be thinking about these lower cost modal options to invest in, like walking and bicycling paths, where you can get a much greater bang per buck in terms of additional trips per dollar spent, and making sure that we're taking action on electrification and other strategies. So when folks are still driving, they're doing so in a way that's not as environmentally harmful.
We have a couple questions now from Veda Flores. Ms. Flores is the chair of the MTC Public Advisory Council Equity and Access Subcommittee. First, she writes, unfortunately, I recently learned that there are no community-based organizations on contract with MTC in Marin County and other North Bay counties. How can our local organizations become CBOs and NGOs for thoughtful conversation? And then secondly, she asks, in the plan E5, economics, called shifting jobs to housing-rich areas, adding jobs to housing-rich areas is great, but Marin will still need the first and last mile rides. How can MTC partner with local government to solve this issue when parking lots are being limited?
Thanks, Vida, for the question. Quickly on the first one, there's an opportunity every 4 years for nonprofit organizations to apply to be partners for our engagement in low-income communities and communities of color. And I believe that one for this current round happened in 2017 or 18. So the next one would happen probably in 2022. With regards to the other question about shifting jobs to housing-rich, transit-rich areas, that strategy is particularly targeting more places around kind of our highest quality transit. So that would be like the BART system in the East Bay, places like Contra Costa County that tend to be very heavy on the housing side and not have as many jobs. But a few locations in Marin County, like downtown San Rafael, were identified in this strategy. And that's where the travel demand management strategy, I believe EN9, plays a key role, is funding bike share and shuttles and other programs that can help people get to and from, as well as the 10,000 mile non-motorized network that is included in the plan.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions here. I'll try and get as many in as we can. We have a question here from Chance Cutrano, a member of the town council for the town of Fairfax. How has MTC ABAG endeavored to avoid creating new development pressure in very high fire risk areas in Plan Bay Area 2050? How is that risk balanced with the need for equitable allocations of housing numbers from the Regional Housing Needs Assessment?
Great question, Chance. So first and foremost, in Plan Bay Area 2050, any area that's a very high fire risk as defined by CAL FIRE is excluded from the growth geography. So there's no additional zoning potential assumed on those parcels. That being said, there are other places in each of those cities, for cities that do have very high fire risk areas, there are other portions of the city that might be a lower fire risk. And those tend to be the areas that we've focused growth in the long range plan in. When it comes to RENA incorporates some key data from Plan Bay Area 2050, but pushes further on advancing fair housing and the key equity goals. And really, when it comes down to the bottom line on RENA, ABAG's role is to assign the allocation, but local jurisdictions are supposed to do that very precise planning of thinking about where within the city, what sites are going to be the ideal locations to allocate that growth. And that is where the fire risk also comes into play, is that as you're selecting sites to accommodate the RHNA, the really thoughtful exercise weighing those trade-offs between various local goals, various local and regional goals.
Okay, we have a question here from Greg Nell. The main asset of most middle-class families is their home. This is the goal of my African-American family members, to own their own single-family zoned home so they can similarly accumulate wealth. We have been denied this opportunity historically through redlining and racist covenants of ownership. Why is the current state legislative goal to eliminate R1 zoning as racist when in fact home ownership is a goal of minority communities? And why is the middle class main asset the target to be eliminated rather than making major employers responsible for providing housing for their employees?
Well, I guess a few thoughts on this, Greg. We certainly recognize that for the vast majority of Bay Area residents, they either are owners or aspire to be homeowners, whether that's a single family home or a duplex or a condo or whatnot. I think it is important to underscore that eliminating single family zoning is not the same as eliminating the ability to have a single family home. It's about allowing more of a mix of housing types in a community. So it doesn't mean that single family neighborhood will change overnight, or that all the units would even turn over, but it might allow for more flexibility if, for example, someone owns a single family home and decides that they want to turn it into a duplex or triplex, allowing 3 families to live in a location that maybe only one could. And that might allow some more folks to join the ownership opportunities in a townhouse or condo type setup and live in a place that perhaps has really well-funded or well-resourced schools. So I think there's a lot of trade-offs there. The origins of R1 zoning really did come from a perspective of exclusion. It originated in Berkeley as they tried to protect a historically white community from the perceived adverse impacts of apartments in that area that were used disproportionately. The residents of those were disproportionately minority. So there are some historic origins of R1 zoning that can certainly be perceived as racist. I think the challenge that the state is trying to take up is, how do we break down those walls of exclusion? How do we allow more folks to live in some of these places that were historically exclusive and create more inclusive places, more diverse places, while still retaining the opportunity to own a single family home or own a multifamily dwelling in those places. Really just trying to create more diverse communities in the process.
Okay, a couple of minutes, so let me keep going here. We have 2 questions on the Northgate Mall area. And Dave, I don't know how granular your familiarity with that area of Marin County is without referring to some of your records, but I'll go ahead and throw it out anyway. From Barry Tarantino, how can we push for the San Rafael planners and city council to develop housing around the underutilized Northgate Mall? And Linda Howman asks, what is your thinking about upzoning and rezoning for more affordable housing in mixed use properties, such as the plans for Northgate Mall?
So I will admit I'm not well versed in this particular site, but what I will say is, one, that the strategy of redeveloping aging malls is incredibly popular with the Bay Area public, because I think regardless of where you live, you can probably think of kind of a dingy 1950s era strip mall that you probably would prefer to either be redeveloped into a nicer commercial property or redeveloped into something new or mixed use entirely. The Bay Area, much of it was built post World War II, and That's 70 years ago. I think those structures are starting to look a little bit old. So I guess since I am not well versed on this particular site, what I would say is I think a lot of lessons can be learned about mall redevelopment and making sure that the redevelopment's inclusive and has affordable units from elsewhere in the region. There's a really interesting project at Hilltop Mall in Contra Costa that's going on right now. There's also an interesting development down in San Jose. There's a mall in the Almaden region that's being redeveloped into a mixed-use center. So some really good opportunities to look around the region and learn.
Okay, I'm going to try and squeeze in two more. We have a question from Linda Jackson. What do you see as the greatest successes of Plan Bay Area since 2014 that is most transferable to Marin? Would it be in transportation and in housing?
I think a couple things, Linda. I mean, I think on housing, one of the big success stories is just how priority development areas across the region have been planned and then developments have occurred on them. So MTC has helped fund specific plans. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. Has funded specific plans across the region. And many of those have actually come to fruition, and we've seen new developments occur, more affordable housing in them, just some exciting opportunities to see station areas around transit, where there might have been a lot of surface parking or other underutilized land, now turned into new and vibrant communities. Certainly we need to see more of that. We're not seeing the levels of housing, especially on the affordable side, that are necessary to bend the curve on this affordability crisis, and that's where more strategies are needed. And on transportation, yes, I mean, there's been a lot of projects advanced since the original Plan Bay Area, whether it's progress on the BART extension to San Jose, opening up the SMART line in the North Bay, the ongoing work on electrification and modernization of Caltrain and BART. So there's some big infrastructure projects as well. And going forward, we see the need for additional funding if we're going to build out kind of this next generation network of improvements where more communities can have access to that high quality transit.
Okay, and lastly, we have a follow-up on Mayor Collins' question. This is from Grace Garrity. Will the state consider counting ADUs in the RHNA goals?
So my understanding is that there is some opportunity to count ADUs as part of RHNA, but there are some restrictions on that. And beyond that, I can certainly point you to our housing and local planning team, who's providing a lot of technical assistance to cities across the region as they work to identify sites.
Okay, fair enough. And speaking of pointing to resources, as David mentioned at the outset, we'll be putting this on the website, the full recording that you've just been able to participate in, and also resources and links that David will provide to us so that you can do some follow-up on your own. Sorry if I didn't get to all of your questions. We got through most of them, I think, but we had a hard stop at 1:15, so we're going to try to meet that. Once again, I want to thank David Vautin from ABAG MTC for an outstanding presentation that really covered a tremendous amount of material in a very concise way, and we appreciate that. I think some of us are going to be watching this again in the repeat because there was a lot of material and it's quite a bit to absorb. So I'm going to thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget our next event, April 27 at noon. Dennis Mulligan, the General Manager of Golden Gate Transit, and Nancy Whelan, General Manager of Marin Transit, for some more fun and hijinks on transit in the Bay Area. Lastly, let me give a shout out and a great thank you to our webmaster and master of ceremonies, Alan Shavitz. Thank you again, Alan, for a terrific job as always. He's not coming on the screen this time. Okay, never mind. Anyhow, we thank you for tuning in. Hope to see you again next month. Thank you for watching. Thank you, David, for an outstanding presentation. And we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.